Thank you. I really like the themes of dependency. Um, I was curious about something you mentioned shortly, and that's I think you mentioned you were obsessed with asymmetrical relationships.
Yeah.
I'm just curious about how you can expand on that beyond the context of being in a hospital or romantic relationships. I don't know any examples of that.
Well, I feel this actually ties in with the moral vanity issue because I have felt, especially sort of talking with my students, this sort of valuation or this fantasy, I think, of a relationship that is like perfectly balanced, where like power relations are exactly equal. And so we can really believe in something we call consent because each party has exactly the same amount of power and so does not feel constrained in any way, et cetera. There's a sense of sort of purity in that. I felt this really intensely teaching a book I love, Alexander Chee's Edinburgh, in which there is a relationship which we experience from the point of view of a 17-year-old boy who very intensely pursues and seduces his 25-year-old swim coach, whom in the first half of the book we experience abuse. He is abused as a child by his choir director, and we experience that from his POV. Very clear to me that this book is thinking about the circulation of violence and the way in which violence we experience is passed on, but also transformed. And it's clear in the book that these relationships, there's not a clear parallel between them, that the relationship between Fee, the older man, and now I'm blanking on the younger man's, the 17-year-old's name, but that relationship is not the same as this very violent child abuse that happens in the first half of the book. My students could not talk about it. They could not talk about it, many of them, because they felt it was so repugnant to consider with nuance, to do anything other than say, this is absolutely, entirely unacceptable and horrifying to have a relationship between a 17-year-old and a 25-year-old. And I was really fascinated by this, and I wanted to know why. And one of my students said, because I remember one student said, I actually felt like the 17-year-old kind of really did want it and did consent and could consent. And a student said, it is repugnant to think that a 17-year-old has the fullness of agency and self-knowledge to consent to a relationship with a 25-year-old. And I said, I am 45, and I don't think I have a fullness of self-knowledge. Like, what would that be? So like only the Buddha can consent? Like this is not a bearable vision of human life. So again, to acknowledge we don't get to be pure. That like we exist, like human life begins with the problematic. And so I think, I am interested in relationships that have very clear structural differentials. Like in my first book, there's difference of money, there's difference of nationality, there's difference of age, there's difference of language, there's difference of a passport, citizenship. All of those structure that relationship, limit that relationship, form and deform that relationship, but they do not exhaust that relationship. They don't utterly strip it of any possible value. And that is like a way of, like a sort of, maybe a sort of particular, that's a way of bringing into relief something that, again, I think is endemic of human existence, which is not only that relationships of power differentials are everywhere, but that also they are mobile, they shift, it's not always the same. You cannot look at the structural facts of someone's life and think you understand that life because of someone's race or age or class, to think that, I see into the sort of interior of this person, of this, like human life doesn't work that way. But also, we like power differentials. We find them sexy. We are drawn to them. And we cannot make situations better. We cannot meaningfully address structures that enable predation if we don't acknowledge that. Because again, that's repression. If we say there is no way a 17-year-old could genuinely desire his 25-year-old teacher, or not teacher, coach. If we can't acknowledge the human fact that absolutely when I was 17, I desired 25-year-olds, and 45-year-olds, or the fact that when I was 14, I was cruising parks and having sex with men in their 40s, and I feel an extraordinary gratitude to those men because they gave me an experience of queer life as something other than shame, as a source of pleasure, as a source of joy, as a source of sociality and friendship. I refuse. I do not give anyone the authority to tell me what those relationships meant. I get to decide what those relationships meant. If we can't acknowledge that kind of complexity, we cannot meaningfully address real problems and meaningfully address the fact that it is really a bad idea for teachers to have sex with their students, and we should address that. If repression is all we have, we're lost. So I'm interested in impurity. I'm interested in being honest. I think you cannot make art if you're not being honest, and I worry very much that our attachment to moral vanity is a commitment to lies. Thank you all so much.